Jay Gabler, Duluth News Tribune arts and entertainment reporter, back with another special episode of the DNT Minute featuring my column, Front Row Seat. This week's column and this week's podcast episode are a little bit different than usual. For one thing, although I do consider Front Row Seat an arts and entertainment column, sometimes I define that kind of broadly. In this case, we're talking about a book, but it's not like a thriller novel or anything like that. It is a nonfiction book called Mining the Heartland: Nature, Place, and Populism on the Iron Range. This is a new book published by New York University Press, written by an author named Eric Kajola. He grew up in DC, but his parents are from the Northland, and his grandparents were in Hibbing on the Iron Range. And so he always had a family connection to the Northland and to the Iron Range. And when he became a sociology doctoral student studying at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, as it happens, he decided that he would turn his focus, his research attention, to the Iron Range. And what he was interested in was within sociology, so the study of human interaction in groups. He was interested in the debates over mining and the debates that are happening and still ongoing on the Iron Range around the copper nickel mines that have been proposed on the Iron Range. Of course, those are still debates that are ongoing through potential policy, et cetera, et cetera. And Eric went up, and from 2014 to 2017, so years he talked to people on the Iron Range in Duluth, in the Twin Cities, all across Minnesota about mining on the Iron Range and the future potentially of mining on the Iron Range. And obviously the concerns are, well, mining has potential economic benefits, potentially supplies needed minerals, but on the other side, there are concerns about the environmental impact of mining on waterways, including the Boundary Waters Canoe area. So Eric was talking to people about those debates. And what he was interested in as a sociologist was, how do people frame these debates when they say why they support the side they do, whether yes, get those mines going, or no, I'm concerned, let's not make this happen. I'm concerned about the environmental impact or what have you. When people talked about their position on these proposed mining projects, how did they talk about that? What kind of arguments did they use? Why did they say they took the position that they did? And, after all those years of research, he had enough to fill a book, this new book, Mining the Heartland. And so I was able to hop on Zoom with Eric and talk about this new book. So this is excerpts from our conversation about his new book, Mining the Heartland.
Thanks for taking a few minutes to talk with me about your new book.
Yeah, definitely. Glad you're interested in it.
Cool. So when you were, according to the book, you spent a few years conducting the interviews and research for this book from 2015 to 2017. What was your experience like in terms of talking to people across Minnesota, especially on the range, about these subjects? Do you find that people were happy to talk about these subjects, or did it get awkward or tense sometimes?
Yeah, I think it's something that, a lot of people are passionate about. And so in some ways, a lot of people wanted to talk, and we're happy to talk about it. Because it's an issue that was near and dear to them, whether they were really concerned about the development of mining or really wanted it to happen. I think in particular for people in the Iron Range who were pro-mining, there was some hesitancy and maybe some skepticism. I'm at the time like a young graduate student from the Twin Cities, and so I think there was an assumption of the angle I would take and some concerns. But as I spent some time up there and made some connections with some key people, I found that there were people who were willing and wanted to talk and wanted to have their voices and concerns heard. And so I was able to talk to people from a lot of different positions, and at times it made it a little bit hard for me. I kind of had to not get too involved in anyone's side, but that did mean that I got to hear from a lot of different types of people. Everyone from people working in state agencies to the leaders of environmental organizations to, some of the leaders of kind of pro-industry groups and some retired miners and folks kind of active in the community.
You mentioned multiple spots in the book, things that surprised you as you conduct your research. What were, a couple of things that stand out now in retrospect in terms of things that surprised you about the way these politics, these dynamics work, the way people framed issues, what standouts in that respect?
Yeah, one thing that stood out is the importance of like collective memories and nostalgia. So kind of those emotional connections to the past. We see the nostalgia for the kind of mining heyday and this hope that copper nickel mining will kind of restore the heyday of Iron Range towns, right? When downtowns were busy, right, there was 10 bars for miners to go to, the local meat store, and all that kind of stuff. And that carries a lot of emotional resonance. And so I think that's where some of the kind of hopes that get placed around copper nickel mining come from, but also that kind of deep collective memories and nostalgia are also tied to people's sense of identity and their sense of place and sense of community. Yes, it's about jobs, but it's not just about jobs, right? But also from the side of environmentalists and conservationists, right? The memories of going on your first canoe trip in the Boundary Waters, or the stories people tell about, the breakfast they got at the cafe in Ely before they head out canoeing. Those things are really emotionally resonant with people, and often also tied to their identities, right? As being a conservationist or being an outdoors person, or tied to their sense of family too. So you really see the real salience and powerful connection to place and to memory that motivates people to get involved in politics.
Another thing you note is it's compared perhaps to some other areas of the country that are having debates around mining extractive industries. You suggested that you heard maybe more talk about the environment from both sides than you would have expected.
Yeah, there's definitely a shared, this is kind of core to northern Minnesota, right? Doing outdoor stuff, right? Obviously, there's tensions, right? Do you canoe or do you use a motorboat and things like that? But definitely some concern that like we need to protect this environment, but yet we happen to maybe believe what the company's saying, or we think that the history of iron mining has been cleaner than maybe it has been, right? So it's also about how do you remember the past and the levels of pollution, also then shapes how you assess kind of future projections or some of the hope or trust you put in. A company like Polymet or Twin Metals saying, our water pollution levels are going to be below the standards, or whatever it might be. But I think there's also there's splits within both sides, and so even in the pro mining side, there's certainly folks who are coming more from labor and more from Democratic aligned, who are somewhat cautious, are cautious and are somewhat skeptical and want to hold the companies to account. And then there's some really kind of industry groups and some really more right-wing leaning pro mining groups that I think are maybe less concerned about that and are really pretty strongly aligned with the industry. There's also similar tensions within some of the groups who are working against mining.
Yeah. Reading your book, I kept thinking about this T-shirt that I saw recently on a guy in Duluth. I kind of did double takes. I couldn't believe I was seeing it, and I had to figure out, is this ironic or not? And my take in the moment was, I know it wasn't ironic. It was sincere, and it had a picture of a cartoon dinosaur on it, and the words across the back of the T-shirt were, "I love fossil fuels."
Yeah, so a number of other writers talk about this idea of petromasculinity and kind of the links between fossil fuels and dominant ideas about masculinity, whether that's what it means to be an oil worker or coal driller, but also the masculinity around a big truck and people rolling coal and all that kind of stuff. And there's some similar dynamics that are operating right within mining and within extractive industries that are sort of similar to that petromasculinity, right? What it means to have a good job, to have a male job, to be a breadwinner, the masculine notion that we can just both like conquer and tear up the earth, but also that we can do it and it'll be all fine.
Yeah. Well, so that's the gender aspect of it. Then you also bring up the race question and the way that nostalgia for extractive industries is also tied up with ideas about race. And I presume you didn't seem to indicate in the book that you heard too much explicit talk about that from the pro mining side. Did you hear much talk about that from people who do not want to see mines move ahead in the range?
In some ways, not a lot either. But there were some exceptions. Some groups and some folks I talked to were thinking about, alongside their work around mining, we're trying to increase access to the Boundary Waters or places up north for working class communities of color, for immigrants. And we're also like kind of really starting to think about some of the assumptions that had gone into some of their conservation work. A big part of U.S. conservation movement history has been very white-led, and other folks have delved into the histories of, some of that being linked to eugenics and other forms of racism. I think one other at times tension in the environmental side and the folks who are either wanted to prevent mining or anti-mining. But some groups are more aligned with indigenous groups and with tribes, and others weren't. So I think some of the groups who are working on PolyMet were working more in collaboration with the Fond du Lac Band and others. But some of the groups who basically were silent on PolyMet but only concerned about twin metals, I think that's where some of the tensions arose, because in some ways PolyMet has a potential greater, if not certainly equal threat to indigenous communities, right, with the Fond du Lac Reservation downstream, but also all this is on 1854 treaty territory.
In terms of looking to the future and, how communities are going to move forward in addressing these conflicts and this, this changing economy, you multiple times, especially towards the end, raise the idea that for an economy like the Iron Ranges to transition to a new, away from this, nostalgia and reliance on mining as key to its identity and economy, you suggest that it's not enough just to create jobs or to bring money to the area or to bring tourists or whatever, but that one reason people are so adamant about these mining jobs specifically is that you use the phrase culturally significant. That this is a kind of work that feels meaningful to a person, helps them feel connected to how they see their community. What could that look like in the future in terms of what kinds of culturally significant jobs might be created in a space like the Iron Range, that people who right now are saying mining is it, what kinds of jobs might they be more comfortable with, if not a mining job?
One, recognizing that people have those connections is important, and just giving that credence, and rather than saying, oh, you can just take any old job. So, I think one of the kind of narratives you hear, right, is that iron from the Iron Range helped the U.S. win World War II and built our cities, right? You hear that all the time. Well, also, producing solar panels, producing windmills, other things like that could be significant to providing essential things for society, right? And so I think there's, both the cultural side and what kind of work is relevant to people, which may also involve asking them and bringing them into decision making, right? Rather than everything being kind of top down and coming in. So if people could be part of community economic development, I think is important. But secondly, right, so there is a cultural part of jobs, but also people want good jobs that have benefits and retirement and good pay. And if you provide someone with those conditions, I think they're open to doing a lot of different things too. So it's not that people are unwilling to do anything but mine, but they're a lot less willing to change if that job's going to pay $12 an hour and not have decent benefits, right? So part of that is making sure that economic development is tied to job conditions, but also strengthening unions, right? That the jobs in the range didn't sort of have to be good jobs, right? It was the long struggle of workers to organize and form unions that made those good jobs. So that also means that jobs that aren't currently good can be made good, right? But that takes a lot of work, right? It's not a simple overnight fix, but recognizing that the power of workers to come together and organize is essential for making any of those jobs good jobs.
Those are excerpts from my conversation over Zoom with author Eric Kjola, a researcher who is the author of Mining the Heartland, Nature, Place, and Populism on the Iron Range. That is out now from New York University Press. I'll be back next week with a column about the new executive director of the Duluth Children's Museum. I actually have never been inside the Duluth Children's Museum since it's moved. When I was a kid in Duluth myself, I remember going to the Duluth Children's Museum when it was in the depot. I know the rest of you Gen Xers out there remember those years. Well, now it is located in Lincoln Park. So I'm going to go stop by the new Children's Museum and talk with their incoming executive director about what he has planned for this institution. Until then, I'm Jay Gabler, Duluth News Tribune.